Today I want to share with you about experience that I had that was truly a life-changing experience. My family arrived in Singapore in 1991 with a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old boy, and one of the key things we had to struggle with in our early years as a missionary family was not having a school for our children. Back in that second year, we had another child. We had 3 sons by 1992. And we were put in a situation where God gave us an opportunity to help start a school in Singapore. Now, you understand that Singapore is the most expensive city in the world to live in. And I found it just over my head to realize that God put me in a place where I was one of 5 founders of the school. We had no money. We had no one standing behind us to say, yes, we'll help you with this. We had no parents except for just a few of us. And actually only 2 of us put our kids in the school. We had no teachers. We had no principal. We had no campus. All we had was a dream to get this school going. And it was one of the most challenging periods of my life. And it was a time where I was quite tempted to discouragement because I felt like I was there and I really did not have the support I needed to do something that was a bigger project than I had ever tried in my whole life. Maybe you can relate with discouragement, because discouragement actually hits all of us. We recently celebrated the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And I encourage you to study the life of Martin Luther, because he was a man like all men, made of the same stuff. And discouragement certainly hit him. Although Luther's parents were pious people, they were shocked when he abandoned his legal studies at Erfurt and entered the Augustinian monastery. Martin was 21 years old when, in July 1505, he gave away all his possessions, including his lute, his many books and clothing, and he entered the black cloister of the Augustinians. Luther thought that being there in the monastery, would be so encouraging for him with all these others who loved God. But being a monk made Luther's discouragement even worse. He would spend hours and hours every day confessing every sin he could think of, but no peace came to him. And he struggled with discouragement, deep discouragement. I think of 2006 when the Lord put it upon my heart to help start a church in Singapore. We had our first worship service, and it was quite encouraging. 58 people came to that first service. And I thought, wow, what a wonderful start. But I soon learned that a lot of those people came to try to just encourage us to start, but they didn't show up the second week or the third week. They all went back to their churches. And within 2 years, the economic crisis hit. If you remember 2008, 2009. And I remember sharing with my congregation about the decreased offerings and how we had so little money left and many unpaid bills. And I remember sharing this particular story with them in one of our congregational meetings. At the present rate of only about $600 a week in offerings, with $2,000 a week in expenses, our bank balance is going to be gone in 5 weeks. We have 5 weeks to exist as a church. And I remember being tempted to be discouraged at that. Have you been discouraged? If you say no, I wonder if you're really telling the truth. Because every one of us faces discouragement. Now, how would you know if you're discouraged? One of the signs is when we're discouraged, we tend to look back at the good old days instead of looking forward. So in your life right now, which way are you looking? Are you looking back or are you looking forward? Discouragement can really get a handle on us. Discouragement sometimes comes when we're ridiculed for our faith by those who don't claim the name of Jesus. But sometimes, in fact, I have found that discouragement hits most when it's the people who are supposed to understand, other believers, who don't pull through for us. And I find that a lot more difficult to handle. Because I expect those who don't know Christ to not be supportive of the value system I seek to have. But when it's the believers who don't do that, it's even more difficult. Discouragement comes when we feel the same old, and we lack purpose, and we need God to do a work in our life. Discouragement really means lack of courage. The word courage is the root word, And when courage is missing, life makes no sense. So we need courage. We need courage. God has given us some great examples of courage, though. And one movie that has had an impact on me is the movie called Courageous. So I want to begin with a short video clip of the movie, at the beginning of the movie Courageous, for you to be able to consider. What would you do if the life of your family was in danger? I trust you would be courageous. But a lot of times we really lack courage, especially in the things that really, really matter. And so I think God's question for us today is, do you need courage today? Think about your own situation in your life right now. Is God asking for you to be courageous about a situation where you tend to be discouraged, where you lack courage? God saying, You need to have courage in that particular thing that you face, whether it relates to family or church or ministry or whatever it might be in your life. How can you defeat discouragement that prevents you from doing God's will? You can be sure Satan he's going to throw everything at you and me to seek to make us discouraged so we don't show the kind of courage we need to show in our ministries. And so another way to say this is, how can you gain courage that enables you to do God's will? That's saying it positively. This is the question we're going to address in this session. How can you gain courage that enables you to do God's will? A lot of times we know God's will. It's pretty clear to us, but we still lack that courage to do it. How can you do that? How can you have that kind of courage? Probably one of the best examples that we can find in the scripture about courage is the man Joshua. In fact, God gave him a mission impossible. I mean, truly impossible. How was he to take 2 million people been out in the wilderness, most of them born in the wilderness, and they had seen very little of anything but rocks. And how could Joshua actually take these people, move them across the Jordan River, and face one of the most formidable cities of their day, named Jericho? And then go from Jericho and conquer city after city of walled giants. Giants behind these huge walls. Been there for a long time. We have been going through our study here since the beginning. And as God has been birthing this people in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, we've seen in Exodus that the Lord began to form his people. He showed them how they could be set apart or sanctified in Leviticus. And then he showed them in Numbers everything they needed to be prepared to go on into the land. But then, of course, they didn't trust the Lord to go into the land. And so they ended up being in the wilderness and staying there, wandering aimlessly until everyone died that was over 20 years old. And we've seen that Exodus is really a picture of salvation, that salvation actually only starts our journey. We need the instruction in how to live a life that's set apart as Christians. And that walk is not without its fumbling. We can identify with Israel in the wilderness with their complaining, with their unwillingness to submit to God-ordained leadership, with their many struggles that they had there in the wilderness, where they were unbelieving believers, you might say. Those who'd placed their trust in the Lord, but they weren't continuing on in trusting God and believing him to do what God wanted them to do. But Joshua begins turning the tide here. It's quite a positive book, because in Joshua we see the occupation of the land. We see Israel trusting the Lord for the most part, and they experience their reward. That reward being a temporal reward. They already had their eternal reward because they had entrusted themselves to the Lord and they had salvation, faith in the true God. But God wanted to give them more than that. God wanted to give them the land. God wanted to give them occupation of the land, and it was quite a promise the Lord gave them at the beginning. Here's what God said at the beginning of the book of Joshua, and I hope you'll follow along and read some of these verses with us as we go through. After the death of Moses, that itself would have been quite discouraging, the servant of the Lord, the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give to them, to the Israelites. And then here's what the Lord said in verse 3. I promise you what I promised Moses. Wherever you set foot, you will be on land I have given you. From the Negev wilderness to the south, to the Lebanese mountains to the north, and from the Euphrates River in the east, and to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, including all the land of the Hittites. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live, for I will be with you as I was with Moses. I will not fail you or abandon you. I love verse 3, because verse 3 says, I will give you every place you set your foot. Every place you set your foot, you're trusting me to move forward. God says, I will give you the land. Now, we will see, especially when we get into the book of Judges, that they didn't conquer all the land, but they did conquer all the land where they set their foot. In other words, when they were willing to step out and trust the Lord, God proved faithful. But when they were not willing to do that, then they saw failure. But they didn't see that much failure in the book of Joshua. It's quite a positive book. The possibility of discouragement must have faced Joshua, who had to fill the sandals of Moses. And who could ever imagine what it would be like to take over the place of one who talked with God face to face so that his face glowed? I'd be shaking in Joshua's sandals if I was following someone like Moses. Maybe you followed a Moses in your life in a ministry that God brought you. So God told Joshua in verse 6, be strong and courageous. For you are the one who will lead these people to possess all the land I swore to their ancestors I would give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the instructions Moses gave you. Do not deviate from them, turning either to the right or to the left. Then you'll be successful in everything you do. Study this book of instruction continually. Meditate on it day and night so you'll be sure to obey everything written in it. Only then will you prosper and succeed in all you do. This is my command. Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or discouraged. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Now, Joshua was one of those 12 spies who had surveyed the land 39 years earlier. He had shown himself to be faithful to trust in the Lord to bring him into Canaan. But with Moses dead, in many ways, Joshua was an untested leader of Israel. And so God helped a man like him to be infused with courage, because did you notice the repetition here? Be strong and courageous. So that's what I'm calling this study of Joshua, be courageous. And the answer to this question, how can you defeat discouragement that prevents you from doing God's will, I believe is found in this book. We're going to look at the whole book of Joshua, a quick survey again, and we will find two ways that we can do this, two ways that we can defeat discouragement. The entirety of the book of Joshua can help us defeat discouragement. And Joshua tells us first that we can conquer discouragement when we act like God will keep his word. When we act like it, when we put our faith into action, as if what God said is actually going to come true. Because on the opposite, discouragement is actually inaction. You notice when people are discouraged, they don't really do much. So this book is telling us, especially in these first 12 chapters, serve the Lord with faith in his promises. Step on out and let it be shown in what you do, in your actions. Now, in Joshua 1, by the time we get to Joshua 1, we see that they have actually already done this to some degree. The tribes of Reuben and Gad and a half-tribe of Manasseh have already received their inheritance on the east side of the Jordan because the people were stepping forth already. But sometimes we can be stepping forth and then we end up falling back. And this is an encouragement to the goal of having all the other 9.5 tribes also receive their allotment. So they are looking toward God actually going ahead of them. And it certainly is not without faith and certain trust in the Lord. As we get to the end of the book of Joshua, we'll see Joshua say at the end of Joshua 24:15, "Choose this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And every one of us needs to make this decision, who we're going to serve. And if we truly serve the Lord, I believe that God gives us the courage we need to do what he wants us to do. And in fact, the key verse of this book, in my opinion, is right here in chapter 1. Don't let this book of the law depart from your mouth. He's talking about what they had already received up to this point. The books of Moses the ink was hardly dry on Genesis to Deuteronomy, and they needed to move forward based on what God had already said. And so he said, meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it, and then you'll be prosperous and successful. God wanted them to succeed. And so, as we saw in Numbers, he helped them to be prepared. He gave them everything they needed to do that. And they were to serve the Lord first basing their lives on what Moses had already written. And the big challenge was facing them right when they crossed the Jordan, and that was Jericho. So what they decided to do, to go to Jericho, which was right across from where they were, across the Jordan River, Joshua decided to send 2 spies. Now you remember, some 39 years earlier, Moses sent 12 spies, right? 2 who were faithful and 10 who were unfaithful. Maybe Joshua learned from that. Let's just not even send the 10 unfaithful guys. Let's just take the 2 faithful guys and send those guys over. And so the 2 spies go over, and you probably know the story where they meet Rahab. Of all people, the one who ends up encouraging the most is Rahab, a prostitute who lives on the wall. God has already worked in her heart to turn her heart to the true and living God. And so she said, "Please swear to me by the Lord that you'll show kindness to my family because I've shown kindness to you." And they agreed that climbing down this red rope, this scarlet cord from her window, that if she would keep that cord there, they would be able to know which home she lived in, and the Lord would actually spare her. Now, you know the story that later on the whole wall falls, right? Well, actually, the whole wall doesn't fall because Rahab's living on the wall, in the wall, and God allowed the wall of Jericho to fall, but he didn't let Rahab's part fall. So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied that scarlet cord in the window and just left it there. But she encouraged them that everybody in the land was fearful of the Israelites. And so they proceeded to cross, in chapter 3, cross the Jordan River. And amazingly so, maybe not so amazing because God's timing is perfect, they crossed exactly 40 years after they crossed the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea more accurately. The Reed Sea crossing began the wilderness wanderings under Moses, and the Jordan River crossing ended the wilderness wanderings under Joshua. The parallels between these two are quite amazing. The first sea they crossed as a sign of their salvation because they had come out of Egypt as believers. The second one they crossed as a sign of getting their inheritance. And I remember leading my first trip. I've been privileged to go to Israel and lead trips there 3 times so far. And I remember leading my first trip, and the Jordan River, to be honest, wasn't very impressive. I remember our bus crossing there, and we just crossed this tiny little area right here, and I said to my tour guide off of the microphone there on the bus, I said, "Hey, can you tell me when we actually cross, okay? And he said, well, we just did. That was it. And I went, what? That was it? That means it's so anticlimactic. I mean, you could walk across that. You don't need any miracle to cross that. What I didn't realize at that time was that when Joshua crossed it, it wasn't the same season that our tour group crossed. When Joshua crossed it, it was a raging river. It was an amazing, amazing crossing of the Jordan. And in fact, it says in Joshua 3:15, now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. And yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, that would have taken a lot of faith and courage, don't you think? As soon as they did that, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a great heap, great distance away at a town called Adam, in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of the Arabah, or the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea, was completely cut off, and so the people crossed over opposite Jordan. Right in the sight of all of these people from Jericho, crossed over opposite Jericho. That must have been frightening for the people of Jericho. It must have been encouraging for the people of Israel. And yet, a lot of things the Lord does in our lives we often forget. And God wanted them to remember. And so he told them, get one representative from each one of the tribes, go pick up a large stone in the middle of the Jordan and bring it on out, and we're going to make one pile of stones. You might call it stones of remembrance. And I hope that you do this in your life, that you have stones of remembrance. Having a holiday like the American Thanksgiving holiday or other types of holidays that we have here in Asia that cause us to look back at God's faithfulness are very, very important. And I hope in your ministry you give priority to the communal Christian year that actually begins with Advent before Christmas and moves on through Christmas and into Epiphany, to Lent, to Holy Week and Easter, and basically ends at Pentecost. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but the Christian calendar really only goes for about 6 months. And then after Trinity Sunday, it's what some call Kingdom Tide or Ordinary Time, and we really don't have any holidays, Christian holidays, from June all the way to November. But in any case, it's very important for us to give priority to these times of remembrance where we look back on what God has done. And they were told to do that. But they were not still spiritually prepared enough to go and conquer the land. And in chapter 5, they stopped at a city called Gilgal. And God told them to do something rather strange. At that time, the Lord told Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise this second generation of Israelites. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the entire male population of Israel at Gibeath Ha'aralot. Gibeath Ha'aralot means hill of foreskins. We're talking about 600,000 plus men who had not been circumcised. They did not have on their bodies the mark of the covenant that God had made with Abraham. They hadn't done the basic procedure to say, we are the people of God. And God said, I want you to do it now, all of you at the same time. Now, if you remember back from Genesis, the same sort of thing happened at Shechem, and all the men at Shechem were slaughtered because during their time of healing, they were not able to wield a sword. This would have been a great test of their faith to actually have these 601,000 fighting age men to be circumcised at the same time. The men of Jericho, had they known about that, could have come out of the city and slaughtered all the Israelites. But I think what God is saying here is spiritual preparation is far more important than military preparation. In fact, it's the most of all the types of preparation you have. And Joshua himself needed to be prepared as well. And so the Lord appeared to him as commander of the army of the Lord. I have now come. In the end of Joshua 5, Joshua's not really sure who's actually there. And he says something quite strange to him. He says, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" Joshua 5:13. And the answer is quite interesting. Neither. Really? God says neither? You're not for us or for the people of Jericho? He says, "Neither, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have come now." And Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" And he said, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy." Joshua did so. Joshua had a quick lesson here that God was either going to be for him if he was holy and follow the Lord, or God would actually fight against him. Do you realize that it's not always Satan who's fighting against us? When we don't follow the Lord, God himself fights against us because he wants us to undergo the difficulties that will hopefully bring us back to him. As we get into Joshua 6, let's just recap some of the key lessons. Well, Rahab chose the fear of the Lord. And she's quite an example of living by faith and not by sight. And we'll see in chapter 6 when Jericho falls that because Rahab's honoring the Lord, even as a Gentile, God honors her. She didn't witness any miracles, but she was convinced that God was powerful enough to take care of her and her family, and her actions showed her faith in God's deliverance. And so Rahab actually is a great picture for us of God's ultimate plan of extending his salvation to the Gentiles. So as a result, her whole family is saved, and she actually becomes a part of the genealogy of Christ we see in Matthew chapter 1. What God is doing in all this is he's faithful in fulfilling the Abrahamic covenant, where all peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. And Rahab's about the first I think the first, that we find that is participating in that, even though she doesn't have the blood genealogy going back to Abraham. So they go in. They stop at Gilgal, and Jericho is just a short distance away. You can visit Jericho today. It frankly doesn't look like a very impressive city today as we measure cities today. But in Joshua's time, with a double wall there, it was quite impressive. In fact, the first wall was 2 meters thick, 5 to 6 meters high on top of a foundation that was 3 to 4 meters high, with an embankment going on up 15 meters to a second brick rampart. This is a huge, huge challenge for someone like Joshua who had never faced something like this. The excavations of Jericho, the fallen walls of the city, show both an inner wall and an outer wall. And it shows that the inner wall actually fell outward, which was quite unusual at that time because battering rams would be used against walls, and walls would fall on themselves or they'd fall inward. In this particular case, the wall fell outward, both the inner wall and the outer wall. So that wall was actually falling out, and as such, it's quite unusual. This began what is called the Central Campaign, where they march on Jericho, and Jericho actually is conquered. And God shows them in this that if they do their plan, they're going to fail. But if they do God's plan, they're going to succeed. Because the military strategy is not exactly one you'll find in your military strategy books. March around a city 7 times, 7 days in a row. Last day, march around it 7 times and shout and blow your trumpets. I mean, that's just not the way life normally goes. That's not how you normally win a battle. God wants us to follow his unconventional ways, though, because it really tests our faith whether we're really entrusting ourselves to him. Unfortunately, in chapter 7, we see that one of the men in Israel named Achan sins against the Lord by stealing some of the things that were quite attractive to him, a Babylonian robe and a bar of silver or gold. And in this chapter, when I preach on this, I call this when Achan's Achan. He's really Achan. And Achan's sin actually ends up leading to the defeat of Israel at the next city called Ai. But the people learn that sin has to be purged, and when they do that, they finally do have victory over Ai. And it's a great reminder to them that it's not military strategies, it's spiritual preparation, it's really following the Lord that gives us the victory. So Ai is attacked a second time once they purge the sin from among them, which is God considered a corporate sin, even though Achan was an individual. And the second time at Ai, they use an ambush from around the back, and they end up taking the city. And then we move on into chapter 9, where they encounter a new difficulty, and that is the people called Gibeonites who deceive Israel, and they come and they say they've come from a long way, and Israel is deceived because they did not trust the Lord in it. That's really the key verse of chapter 9, verse 14. The men of Israel sampled their provisions, but they did not inquire of the Lord. Then Joshua made a treaty of peace with them and let them live, and the leaders of the assembly ratified it by an oath. Well, they could not then conquer the Gibeonites, who were there in the center. Gibeon was right in the center of the center part of Israel. But God had his plan here, and Gibeon ended up becoming attacked by the other cities that came from the south and attacked Gibeon. And so God used it so that Israel, going and protecting Gibeon according to their promise, ended up conquering all these various places. And so they went, and the southern campaign actually came about as a result of this. Israel, being deceived by not consulting the Lord in chapter 9, ended up with a battle over the 5 kings of the Amorites in the south and victory over all of them, so that the southern cities were actually conquered. All of them conquered as a group, all in one day. In Joshua 10, in the ending of this battle, we see the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. And never has there been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a man. And we see this southern campaign wrapping up. So they've conquered the middle of the land, they've conquered the southern part of the land, and only remaining is in chapter 11, where they have the northern campaign, and they go up to the north, and God uses the city of Hatzor, the key city up there, to gather all the people together and bring them into one place where they are able to conquer all of them. It's quite incredible. But the key lesson here in all of these is that faith and obedience in God result in victory. If we obey the Lord and we do it with a perspective of trust, then we do experience victory. And yet, when we don't trust the Lord, when we're not willing to step out in faith, normally that means that we're not being obedient. And we see every time they do that, as in the case of Achan and as the case of the Gibeonites, they don't experience victory. And so when we get to chapter 12, it's quite kind of a summary chapter of all the cities that they have conquered. Chapter 12 lists them all. And one by one, we see 31 kings conquered, the last verse of Joshua 12. Well, what does all that mean to you and me? Because the Lord has not called us to go and conquer cities today. We live in a different age, but here's what I think is the key principle here. When we're courageous and act, we see God do his thing. We are courageous when we act, as if God will fulfill his promises to us. Courage is not based on our own gut will. Courage is based on the promises of God. And when we act on the promises of God, we find that God truly does give us the victory. I'm sure you can give some examples. I hope you can in your own life. I shared with you earlier about how we were trying to start a school in 1992 with basically no resources. It's similar to Martin Luther, just not knowing where to go. I mean, he basically just posted in faith and claimed he was willing to act against the claim that the Pope's pardon would forgive everybody's sins if they gave money to the church. And this was a public way to nail notices to the action, to take action. And God certainly honored the faith of Martin Luther that was willing to take action. This was public. How public are you in your faith? It's one thing to be kind of private, and if there's a failure, nobody knows about it. But we're courageous when we act as if God's promises are really true, and we're public about it. I'd share with you about how our church was just basically getting crushed, and financially speaking. But God pulled us out of it. The church is still now working, and I still have the privilege of investing in men and women there. In fact, we recently hit the point for the first time where we have 3 pastors attending our church from 3 different seminaries in Singapore, 2 from India and 1 from Myanmar, that I have this privilege of investing myself in to help them train to be pastors back in their homeland after they graduate with their master's degrees. It's such a joy. But it never would have happened if I just curled up in discouragement. I had to step forth. It's the same for the school that we helped start, that now has 480 students. And we have seen God work when we step out in faith, and I trust you have as well. So how can you defeat discouragement that prevents you from doing God's will? Well, act like God will keep his word. Discouragement is inaction. So don't let discouragement cause you to do nothing, but step forth, trusting the Lord. And you know what happens? What results when you show courage? When we conquer discouragement, when we actively trust God to keep his word, and what results from that is victory. That doesn't mean, it doesn't look the same all the time, but courageous faith brings victory. So trust in God results in his rewards. In the latter half of Joshua, which splits quite nicely right in the middle, it's a 24-chapter book. The first 12 chapters talking about conquering the land. The second 12, chapters 13 to 24, give the results. The conquering of the land leads into the occupation or the settling of the land. And we see as we get to Joshua 13, the borders of the land end up becoming clearer as it relates to the various tribes. The tribes across the border have already been allotted, but in chapter 14 we see Manasseh, Ephraim, Judah. Chapter 18, they end up drawing lots for the remaining tribes. And so by the time we get to chapter 19, the various tribes all have their allotments. Manasseh and Ephraim, the sons of Joseph, have their double portion. They actually have 2 tribes. Remember, the firstborn son gets a double portion. And then not only that, Judah is a favored tribe because the kingly line is going to come from Judah. So the center of the land actually goes to Manasseh, Ephraim, and Judah. And then the other 7 tribes, by lot, receive their allotments. Benjamin in the south, Simeon within the tribe of Judah, Zebulun and Issachar in the north, and Asher, Naphtali in the very, very north. And the tribe of Dan, and all the others that are around the edges that are not part of Israel, Moab and the Ammonites, all that remains the same. Because God told Israel, I'm not going to give you any of the land of the Moabites or the Edomites or the Ammonites. And when we get to chapter 20, we see that actually the various tribes have different numbers of people, putting them together with the book of Numbers. And you'll see that actually the largest tribe, Judah, 76,000, has the largest area to the south. And The other large tribes like Manasseh has a key area right in the middle, and the Levites are spread throughout the land. And as the Lord said to do in Numbers 35, Joshua 20 specifies these 6 cities of refuge for those that have committed capital offenses, but God wanted to institute this practice where people, instead of taking the law into their own hands, what they needed to do is they needed to entrust themselves to go to these cities of refuge until the death of the high priest, and it kind of slowed things down. People weren't ready for civil law, of courts of law quite. This sort of an intermediary situation where God allowed these cities of refuge instead. The Levitical cities are appointed, and the Levites get their 48 cities. And we find, finally, when we get to chapter 22, a reminder that God unites, but sin divides. Because the tribes almost come to having war against one another, but that is averted because they do talk with one another. And it is a challenge to bring all these tribal groups all into one nation. Sort of like what we see in Singapore with the Singapore Civilian War Memorial. We have 4 pillars there in the downtown Singapore that represent Chinese, Malays, Indians, and Westerners that all work together to see the Japanese occupation end from 1942 to 1945. And the book ends in chapter 24 doing what Deuteronomy 27 said to do, to have the cursings and the blessings of Deuteronomy declared publicly there at those mountains. And here is where Joshua tells the people that they still had a choice as to who they were going to follow, and he was going to follow the Lord. So his charge renews the covenant, and the people respond and say, yes, we're going to follow you. In fact, they make a stone monument before that time in Joshua 22 that is a sign of the unity of the nation. And Joshua says he is going to lead the charge to really serve the Lord. And I believe the same is true for us. God will also reward us. God will also reward your courage when you stick your neck out for him. That's real courage. When you have to do it and you may not have all that you expected to support you. I found this true with International Community School that I was a part of helping begin in 1993, and by God's grace now has 480 students. We have seen the Lord do a great thing, but it didn't come without some measure of courage. Luther found the same thing because the whole Reformation came because he was courageous. And I found the same thing with us at the church. God has prospered it. We're still a small church, but God has given us an opportunity to touch many different nations, even as a small church, with people coming from all over Asia that are there in Singapore. So how can you defeat discouragement that prevents you from doing God's will? Let me see if I can sum up the book of Joshua all in one statement. Joshua records Israel's occupation of most of Canaan in fulfillment of God's faithfulness to his promise through Joshua's faith, in order to instruct the nation that obedient faith based on God's promises brings blessing. See the key ideas there? Occupation, God's faithfulness, matched or paired with Joshua's faith brings blessings. Or maybe if I could say it more succinctly, God rewards those who take him seriously. Take him seriously enough to step forth and truly put themselves out on line for him. He tells us to act like God will keep his word, and then he tells us the results that courageous faith brings victory. So how specifically can we defeat discouragement? We find that from Joshua that we need to be led by God's presence. And we find that we need to remind ourselves and others of God's faithfulness. And I hope you do that. You have those reminders like the memorial stones in your own life. And you see the importance of setting yourself apart as they did in chapter 5 for his purposes. So that God's commitment to the Abrahamic covenant where he says, I will make you into a great nation, I will bless you, will be something that you experience in your own life, where you can trust God as the ultimate redeemer and the provider of all that you need. We see that once they finally get into the land, the people ate the produce of Canaan and the manna stopped because they were ready at that point, finally, to entrust themselves to the Lord. And I trust that as you do that, you will see the Lord of Joshua is also your Lord and just as faithful to you.